Hello and welcome to Ram Central. I'm your host, Anthony Manna, and I have a special treat for Ram Country out there. Every now and then I like to do an additional post to what I normally do during the week. So sometimes it'll be a top 10, sometimes it'll be a breaking news that broke, big free agent signing, draft day, those kinds of things. Or sometimes I'll just come on with some random information that I think Ram Country would like to hear. So that's kind of the purpose of these little in-between shows, if you will. And today I'm going to do a top 10 Ram teams of all time. Now keep in mind this is all-encompassing. It's a little bit of Cleveland, a little bit of St. Louis, and a whole lot of LA. So you're going to get a little bit of everything here, so to speak. I will say before I begin, all videos that are used during the duration of this show are property completely owned by the National Football League. I have no intention of selling it for profit. It's just being used as a primary resource to further the point that I'm going to be trying to make with the information that I want to give. So it's property of the National Football League, ESPN, CBS, NBC, ESPN Classic, NFL Network, anyone and everyone that I pulled it from. It's their property, not mine. I want to put that disclaimer out there because I don't want this being taken down for copyright purposes when I'm not using it for any other purpose but for historical reference to what I'm talking about. And I do have a little bit of video clippage for every single team that I'm going to mention in this video. And you'll see it, and then I'll go into it. So without further ado, let's begin with my top 10 Ram teams of all time. So before I begin, I want to set the groundwork here a little bit. I'm a big-time historian when it comes to football, when it comes to the Rams, when it comes to getting information. I, especially as a young kid, soaked it up as a sponge. So this is years of research that I've put forward that I think is important for the fan to know that I didn't just put this together last night. This is something I've thought about a lot, I've focused on a lot, and I've really tried to make sure I can get the best possible reasoning behind why I chose some of these teams. Now, if for whatever reason you disagree, you vehemently have an argument, you think my top 10 is all out of whack, I left a team out, you want to make mention, post it in the comments section. And what I'll do is I'll take a look at it, I'll respond, as I usually do, but also the intention behind it is, who knows? It may create a revised top 10. I might even do a fans top 10 Ram teams of all time and see which ones are, different from my own. So with that being said, I hope you enjoy it and sit back and watch the top 10 Ram teams of all time. Number 10. Number 10 is on here because of a statistic. Probably the statistic if you follow the Rams. And certainly it's a record, obviously, that I don't think will be broken anytime soon in today's pass-happy football. That statistic and that record is rushing yards in a season, single season, 2,105 by Eric Dickerson. Now that 84 team had a lot to overcome. It was John Robinson's second year as a head coach. It was Dickerson's second year in the pros. He had just come off an 1,800-yard rushing season, broke a rookie record, and a lot of people had high expectations. And people knew that the Rams were a struggling passing attack still, even though Ferragamo was, played relatively well in 83. But despite all of that, Ferragamo was lost after the Week 2 game against Cleveland for the season. And they're kind of put in a conundrum. Kemp comes in, holds the fort pretty well, but he's a weak quarterback, statistically, historically at best, and that causes a lot of problems. So this Ram team has Eric Dickerson, and that's pretty much it. A lot of injuries on that team, a lot of key players missing a lot of time, and despite all of that, the one constant was Dickerson ripping through defenses. You take into account the injuries, you take into account that they never had their best team on the field at any point in the season, and you take into account that they had to go 7-3 down the last 10 games of the season, just to make the playoffs. They were 3-3 going into week 7, and they didn't look good doing it. So for them to really turn it on that second half, a little before the second half of the season, I think is important. Although they went 5-3 in both the first and second half, it's that 7-3, rocket finish that they really, I think, put them over the top. But it was all about Dickerson, and rightfully so. He broke the record in 15 games. It took OJ 14, but he still broke it and ended up adding on to it the final week of the season against San Francisco before losing to the New York Giants in the wild card game. But it was an improvement from 83. They were 9-7 in 83 when they made the playoffs. This time they were 8-10-6, and they hosted a wild card game, albeit they lost 16-13 in a heartbreaker. But nonetheless, I think that team bears being on the list because of their performance, because of Eric Dickerson, and obviously the record. So without further ado, here's some footage of number 10.
Running back, number 29, Eric Dickerson.
For L.A., it was their 10th playoff game in 12 years. It also proved to be their final game of the season. In a pad-popping defensive battle, the Rams held the Giants to 1 touchdown. But they fared no better themselves. Their offense outgained New York, but couldn't quite break loose for the big play. Appropriately, LA's only touchdown of the day was scored by Eric Dickerson. The Rams wound up 3 points short. Their hopes of reaching the Super Bowl shattered for the 2nd straight season. Still, it was a year of historical performances. Against Houston, Dickerson strode into history with style, eclipsing O.J.'s record with a career-high 215 yards.
He's got it, and a brand new single-season rushing record for the outstanding star from Southern Methodist.
While Dickerson was one singular sensation, his epic season was an achievement shared by the entire Rams family. For on this team, there is respect between players, rapport between players and fans. It's all part of the atmosphere that is the Rams family plan. The spirit that abides at Anaheim reaches from the fans right to the top.
So that's number 10. A couple things that I want to say here before I go into number 9, just to finish up with the number 10 team. The 1984 Rams have two things that I think are very interesting. One, that's Henry Ellard's coming out party. He kind of proved to the Rams, hey, I'm more than just a punt returner, and I can play wide receiver. I'm ready to start. And he led the team in receiving yards that year and began his Hall of Fame career ascension from that point. Really launched him after the relatively successful 83 season. 84 was even better for him. Also, for you Madden buffs out there, it should be interesting to note that this is one of the teams, if you played the old Madden games that had the classics, the 1984 Rams were always one of those classic teams that you could choose from. So if the man agrees with me, then clearly they belong on this list. So that's my number 10 team, the 1984 Los Angeles Rams. Number 9. So number 9 is a choice on here that I think is really hard to refute or argue. Number 9 is the 1989 Los Angeles Rams. Now, I have the 1989 Rams on this list for a lot of reasons. Many people who follow the 89 season will widely agree, and Chris Berman even had said this, that the two best teams in football in 1989 played in the NFC Championship game at Candlestick Park. All year long, the two best teams were the Rams and the 49ers. Now, I know Denver had a better record. The Rams, record-wise, had the third best record that year, but they were unequivocally the best team, hands down, that year. Even though they weren't a 3 seed because the team in their division went 14-2, that's why. But they actually would have had a tiebreak over New York if you were to do it just based on records, because they had beat New York earlier in the year, even though New York was the 2 seed. but it's more than that. They get off to this great 5-0 start. Along that 5-0 start, they actually beat the 49ers 13-12 in Candlestick in what is the greatest game I've ever seen. And I've watched a lot of football. Regular season-wise, there's no better football game that's ever been played than the physical, fight that occurred at Candlestick Park between the Rams and 49ers. They win that game. They go to 4-0. They end up going 5-0 before losing a heartbreaker on Monday night to the Bills. They just ripped our hearts out at the end of the game and beat us and put us on a 4-game losing streak. That was the first of the 4 games that we lost. But down the stretch, the Rams would end up going 6-1, beating everybody. The only team they lost to was the San Francisco 49ers in LA, 30-27, a game in which San Fran had to overcome 2 17-point deficits to come back and win. So the Rams just dominated all season long, and even that was, you knew it was going to be a great game or at least everyone felt it was going to be a great game when those two teams played in the conference championship game. But if you want to go into statistics, we can go into that. I mean, Ellard led the team in receiving with 1,382 yards on 70 receptions. Flipper Anderson had a 26 yards per reception average with 1,146 yards on just 44 receptions, aided by a record-breaking 386-yard receiving performance against the Saints on Sunday night that year that the Rams won in overtime, 20-17. And Everett set a record that wouldn't be broken until the days of the greatest show on turf. He threw for 4,310 yards and 29 TDs. And Everett was widely considered one of the best players that year in the National Football League by anybody that was paying attention. But it wasn't just that. You had Greg Bell rushing for over 1,000 yards, and John Robinson's system was really in full swing. Everyone felt that this is the best Ram team we've seen in the John Robinson era. Certainly the most complete team. So it's not about that, though. I mean, that's all important, and that's part of the reason they're number 9. But then you get into another record that they broke. So the final week of the season, 89 was crazy. 17 teams are still alive for the postseason going into the final week of the regular season, week 16. Monday night, 4 teams were dependent upon the outcome of the Cincinnati Bengals-Minnesota Vikings Monday night game. So there was a lot of teams that were still hoping to make the playoffs. But the Rams were simple. All they had to do was beat New England in New England. But they had to travel from Los Angeles to New England in the cold and beat the Patriots. With a second left, New England has the ball inside the Rams' 10-yard line. The Rams prevail, and they win 24-20 to make the playoffs. And then in the wild card game, they have to travel from Los Angeles to Philadelphia. And many people felt like the Eagles were going to just roll them. And certainly Philly had done their fair share of trash talking to the point of nauseum and really upset a lot of people. And what ended up happening is the Rams gave them an old-fashioned beatdown. And it wasn't even close. And anybody who was following the Rams that year knew Philly had no chance to beat the Rams. They weren't a complete team. It wasn't just that they didn't have a running game. Reggie White wasn't going to get the best of Jackie Slater. And Jerome Brown wasn't going to get the best of Doug Smith. And the Rams were going to find a way to hit those wide receivers for big plays. And it's exactly what they did. So what I have for you here next is some footage of the 89 Rams and a little bit about the wild card game. So here it is.
60 minutes long, but the game between the Rams and Eagles was over after 7 minutes and 12 seconds because that's how long it took LA to run up a 14-0 lead. All week long, the Rams heard why they wouldn't win this game. Now the Eagles will be asked all season long why they couldn't win. Now the Eagles were claiming that LA couldn't win in cold weather. Jim Everett finishing the day with 281 yards and 2 touchdowns, including this one, as Izell Jenkins gambles and Ellard makes him pay. The offensive line protected Jim Everett against Buddy Ryan's troops. He was sacked only 2 times during the day. And they also got another great running game, back-to-back games by Greg Bell. Bell, 144 yards, total offense. But afterwards, they proved they were more than just Hollywood's team.
They said all we were Hollywood. And they're right, we are Hollywood, but we enjoy being out there. We enjoy playing in those, that warm weather, but we don't mind coming back here and sticking it to somebody who really, can get on your nerves.
Anytime you play Philadelphia, you get the hype of their head coach, which and their players and certain players that that we lived on. We might live next to Hollywood, but we can still play tough football.
That guy didn't make the Pro Bowl either. So the matchup next Sunday, you've got the Rams playing the third straight road game. They head into the Meadowlands, a place where the Giants lost only once this season. That was to the Eagles. New York favored by 3.5. But the Rams have fared well in the past 2 meetings against the Giants. Week 10 of this year. It was the Giants looking very weak in the secondary. Once again, Everett given plenty of time. L.A. took a 24-3 halftime lead. Everett effective at picking apart the secondary. Also, the Giants hurt themselves. Megan is going to the Pro Bowl. He can break them or break your heart. He fumbled. The Giants lost this in 31-10. The Giants last year at the Meadowlands also had their problems there. Week 4, and it's Everett, a career-high 5 touchdowns. Again, testing that Giants secondary. If you don't put pressure on Everett, he'll make you pay. Turnovers also crucial. The Rams' touchdown set up by Giants miscues. Jeff Hostetler's pass is coughed up here. And the Rams won at 45-31.
Now, after that game against the Philadelphia Eagles, the Rams would have to once again go from the West Coast to the East Coast and have to play the New York Giants, making it the 3rd consecutive week in a row that the Rams had to do that. No NFL team had ever done that before, and no other NFL team has done that since, where the playoffs made up the last 2 of the 3. So it was quite an amazing run. And the Rams do end up going into New York, and this is how they won it. The part with Flipper Anderson running into the tunnel is iconic in NFL playoff lore. For Ram fans, we'll forever remember it as one of the greatest moments in our history. And for Giant fans, probably one of the most frustrating ends to probably one of the more frustrating games for them. That game's interesting. The Rams had no business winning it. They were dominating in the first half and hit Flipper Anderson for a touchdown just before half to go up 7-6. The Giants responded with, I believe, no, the Rams would then come back and kick a field to go up 10-6. They would score a touchdown to make it 13-10. The Rams would tie it with one of the greatest clutch kickers in NFL history, and Mike Lansford, certainly in Ram history, to tie it at the end of regulation, and then in overtime they won the toss and scored the touchdown. Again, there was a lot of controversy in that overtime, but it is what it is, and the Rams ended up winning. But because of the West Coast to East Coast trips they had to take, it wore the Rams completely out going into the conference championship game. Now, before I get into the conference championship game, I do want to say this. There's one correction I want to make. The Rams were widely considered by a few, obviously any Rams fan, but Pat Summerall, John Madden, and Chris Berman all kind of believe the Rams were the second best team in the National Football League. As I said, they considered the NFC Championship game the Super Bowl. And even though the Broncos were the number 1 seed in the AFC, they had an 11-5 record as well. And when you do tiebreakers, the Rams would have had statistical tiebreakers. If you look at conference wins and things like that, the Rams would have had a tiebreaker over Denver, but they're not in the AFC. They would have had a tiebreaker over the Giants because they beat them head-to-head in L.A., but they weren't in. They have divisions, and the Giants won theirs and the Rams didn't, so they didn't get that seed. Philly got the tiebreaker over the Rams, I believe, because of division record, which is one of the tiebreakers that they had, so the Rams had to go to Philly. Had they been able to host a wild card game, the NFC Championship game is a very different outcome. Whether the 49ers win or not, I'm not going to argue. I think the 49ers probably do still win, but I think it's going to be more like that 30-27 LA San Fran game, not 30-3. I mean, the Rams just clearly didn't have anything left. They came out strong in the first quarter. They led 3-0, and then it was just over. And, I'm not going to tip my hat to the 49ers because I hate the 49ers, but you have to give respect where respect's due, and they were the best. They were the better team that day. and they were the best team in football that year, and they earned the right to be the team of the decade. So that wraps up number 9. Number 8. Number 8's an interesting one. Number 8 is the 1967 Los Angeles Rams, a team that went 11-1-2, the second best year win percentage-wise in franchise history. The second best or longest winning streak in franchise history with an 8-game winning streak. They beat Green Bay in LA 27-24 when no one expected it. And they're going to forever be remembered as the year the Fearsome Foursome just completely took storm. You had Rosie Greer, Lamar Lundy, Deacon Jones, Merlin Olsen. They were the greatest front four in football at the time, and arguably the most athletic and the most difficult to handle. Sound familiar? Sounds real familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like 2016 Los Angeles Rams, right? Really excited for this upcoming season with that front four. Kind of the new Fearsome Foursome. But the old Fearsome Foursome dominated that year. And after a loss, they would have back-to-back ties and then not lose again and actually go to Lambeau to play the Packers the week before the Ice Bowl. And it didn't turn out well. But nonetheless, that 67 team is definitely worthy of being on the list. You had Roman Gabriel, Jack Snow, Dick Bass, who was one of the great Ram running backs of all time, who was running and tearing up defenses when he had the opportunities. Just a loaded football team. And as I said, they had Jack Snow. They were just a good football team. So without further ado, you can go ahead and check out the number 8, 1967 Los Angeles Rams.
Deacon Jones, Merlin Olsen, Rosie Greer, and Lamar Lundy combined to form the infamous Fearsome Foursome, a defensive line whose rule over opposing offenses in the 60s was a reign of terror. They were a cement wall that frequently came tumbling down on helpless quarterbacks. By bruising the bodies of opposing signal callers, the Fearsome Foursome won the hearts of the fans. Quarterback Roman Gabriel's boyish good looks were not reflective of his rugged playing style. Much like running back Dick Bass, number 22. Bass's jitterbug running style was not reminiscent of the members of the bull elephant backfield. However, he kept the Rams' running attack exciting.
So you can see why they're number 8. Great football team. Next up is number 7. Number 7 is the 1969 Los Angeles Rams. Now, that team did a couple of things that hadn't been done in Ram history. One, they really put the Rams on the map and started getting people talking like this was the best team in football. They got off to an 11-0 start, and no one disputed that the Rams were going to be the team to beat. But then something happened. Week 12, the 11-0 Rams hosted the 10-1 Minnesota Vikings, and Minnesota beat them 20-13. And it kind of started a spiral of 3 straight losses. And the Rams ended up finishing 11-3. But no Ram team ever before or since won 11 straight games at any point, even if you take the combination of a couple of seasons. So it's the longest winning streak in Ram history. It's also the longest winning streak to start a season in Ram history. And they finished 11-3. The season, though, for me, the 11-0 start, is second to Roman Gabriel's MVP season. So you have to remember this is 69. There's teams are throwing. You've got the AFL going ballistic, but this is the NFL, and the NFL is pretty much about running and doing what it needs to do with defense and old smash mouth football. Roman Gabriel's lighting people up. He ended up throwing for 2,549 yards, 24 TDs to only 7 interceptions. He runs away with the National Football League MVP award. And the Rams itself that year were a pretty interesting group. They got off to that fast start. They struggled, and they go into Minnesota in the divisional playoff game, and they lose, they lose 23-20. But it wasn't about the loss. It was kind of the realization of we're ending this decade of futility with 2 strong seasons in it. And really, since George Allen had showed up, the Rams never had a losing season. But they only had 2 playoff seasons to show for it. But they kind of set the groundwork for the 1970s and really started figuring out how they were going to get talent, what they were going to do, and really kind of revitalize the city and the organization. So without further ado, here is the number 7 team in Ram history, the 1969 Los Angeles Rams.
Gabriel earned the league's MVP award in 1969 with the help of linemen like Charlie Cowan and Tom Mack and receiver Jack Snow, number 84. Snow was a sure-handed pass catcher who stood out in a crowd.
So that is number 7, and we are going to round out the top 5 with number 6. Number 6 is the 1975 Los Angeles Rams. The Rams had a stretch from 73 to 79 that is arguably the greatest stretch in franchise history. I don't even think you can argue it, to be honest with you. I don't even think it's arguable at this point. But they definitely were at the height of their greatness in 1975. In 1973, when they finally bursted on the scene, they also went 12-2, which is the same record they had in 75. But the 73 team, despite John Hadl having an incredible season, the Rams were kind of new. They bursted onto the scene. They'd been competing with the 49ers, but hadn't quite broken through. And they just exploded in 75 and took a lot of people by surprise. But ultimately, it didn't materialize. They didn't win a playoff game, and they ended up, that being the end of it. 75, however, they go 12-2, and they're just dominant. They lose the opening day game to Dallas, 18-7 in Dallas. And really, with a ton of turnovers, had an opportunity to really just put Dallas away early, but never was able to accomplish that. They would then win 6 in a row before losing at home to San Francisco by 1 point, 24-23. Then they would win their next 6 games to finish the season 12-2. And again, for you Madden enthusiasts, like the 1984 Rams, the 1975 Rams are one of those teams that always showed up on the classic teams that you could play with, ironically. So, and I think there's good reason for that, because this was the best of that bunch, talent-wise, record-wise, performance-wise. And an interesting note of the 70 Rams, they only lost to Pittsburgh once in the 1970s. Just once. And that was Super Bowl 14. And technically that was in 1980. So they really never lost to the Steelers at all in the 70s. But I say that because Week 16, in a game they didn't necessarily need because they had everything wrapped up, and they had home field at that point, they still stuck it to Pittsburgh 10-3 in LA. So, and the defending champs lost to the Rams. The Rams really showed their strength and why this team is so revered as a top 10 team in Ram history. And I would argue not just by me, but by a lot of people, because that team was so dominant. And never were they more dominant than they were in the divisional playoff game against the St. Louis Cardinals. They beat them 35-23, and it wasn't even really that close. It was 28-9 at halftime. It was 35-16 at one point. Might have even been 35-9. I can't remember, but I do know that the Cardinals made a little bit of a comeback. Actually, no, it was 28-9 at halftime, and they made it 28-23. And before you're like, wow, they almost blew it, they were never in doubt. I mean, the last 2 minutes of the game, or 7 minutes of the game, the Rams were just, it was over. And they have a crazy touchdown at the end of the game to win it. But their defense was so dominant that it really gave people pause. And people thought, well, they beat Pittsburgh. They've beaten everybody but Dallas. I mean, this is it. I mean, Dallas is coming to their place. They're going to beat the Cowboys. And that's where the embarrassment really began. There is nothing I can say to vindicate or give an excuse on why the Rams lost. Dallas came in and kicked our butts. And I mean kicked our butts. They left no doubt that they were the best team in the NFC that year. And anybody that tries to argue, they swept us. They beat us there, and they crushed us in LA. And the part that I'm frustrated with is, I don't know if they thought it was a foregone conclusion or what, but they're down 34-0 before Cappelletti scores a meaningless touchdown from a yard out to make it 34-7, and then the defense still gives up a field goal at the end. It was Roger Staubach at his finest and the Rams at their worst. Turnovers, you name it, it went wrong for the Rams, and that's where the 75 season and the number 6 Ram team of all time sadly comes to a crashing halt. But what they accomplished that year really can't be argued. Lawrence McCutcheon had a strong year. I believe he rushed for 911 yards. Didn't quite crack 1,000, had some injuries, but was still a great runner. And the Rams were, the best team in football that year. Record-wise, there was no one better in 75. It was the Rams and then everybody else. But unfortunately, Los Angeles stumbled at the gate for the second consecutive year. But I'm not going to show you the footage of the championship game. I am going to show you just how dominant that team was, though, by showing you some highlights from the 1975 NFC Divisional Playoff game between the Los Angeles Rams and the St. Louis Cardinals. Here it is.
Let's take a look at some of the highlights of the first half. Obviously, the action was dominated by the Los Angeles Rams. And as Ricardo said, what a defense out here on the West Coast. They were ahead by a score of 7-0 when Jimmy Hart tossed this pass out into the right flat. And Jack Youngblood, who can run about as fast as any defensive lineman, well, his teammate Freddie Dryer probably can keep up with him, but that's about all. It was 14-0. Terry Metcalf has played sensationally. What a shame that they can't cash in on any of these returns so far. 66 yards for number 21 right here, right down to the Ram 33. Jimmy Otis, though, coughed up the football, and Fred Dryer, the other defensive end for the Rams, pounced on it. It was one turnover after another in the early going. Terry Metcalf here will take a Jim Hart pass, and he will run 33 yards down to the Rams' 42-yard line. Just cuts back across the grain and finds daylight. Oh, how he runs under control until he finds that opening and then turns it on. But as Frank Lieber has pointed out, a couple of interceptions have done the job. And here is Bill Simpson, who always seems to be around that football, picking off this pass on the Ram 33, and he'll take it back 67 yards for the touchdown. And after the Dempsey extra point, it was 21-0. Screen pass to Jim Otis here for a 21-yard gain as the Cardinals finally got something going. They got down to the Ram 25-yard line. And from the 4-yard line, Jimmy Otis crashed across. Extra point was no good. And then Ron Jaworski filling in for the injured James Harris, 68 yards, Harold Jackson, and so at the half it is 28-9.
So you see just how dominant the number 6 team truly was. Now I do want to say one thing. I do want to make another correction. I had said that the Rams beat Pittsburgh in Week 16 in LA. Of course, in 1975 they were 12-2. They only played 14 games, so it was actually Week 14 that they beat the Pittsburgh Steelers 10-3 in a game that they didn't necessarily even need to wrap things up. But you do understand, watching that highlight, just how dominant that Ram team was. And even though the Cardinals came back, no one thought they were going to come all the way back. And the Rams really shut the door when they needed to and really solidified, I think, their spot on this list as the 6th best team in Ram history. Coming up, we're going to do the second half of the top 10.